welcome to the School of Speech podcast, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. School of Speech is designed specifically for the school-based SLP to come together to discuss current topics, tackle difficult situations, and share our insights. Our goal is to bolster confidence, celebrate our triumphs, and foster a community dedicated to the excellence in the school setting.
Hello, everybody. I'm Carolyn Dolby, and I am your SpeechTherapyPD.com podcast host for School of Speech. School of Speech is designed for school-based SLPs to come together. We're going to explore current trends, share insights, and really champion our expertise. Our goal is to bolster confidence, celebrate our triumphs, and foster a community dedicated to the excellence in the school setting. Today's episode is Communication and Down Syndrome, a Developmental Approach for School-Based Clinicians. We have Dr. Laura Mattie joining us today to share the latest research on the communications and language profiles of children with Down syndrome. She will be navigating our exploration of current evidence that is available. She'll be discussing both its strengths and the limitations in understanding language development within this population. Along this journey, we will gain valuable insights for all of us school-based clinicians that will amplify our decision-making and enhance our approach for supporting the communication needs for children with Down syndrome that we find on our caseload. Before we get started, I'm going to just kind of go over some of our disclosures. Dr. Mattie receives salary support from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Did I get that right? Yeah. Oh, good. I was worried for a second. And then also grants from Campus Research Board, as well as the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And if that's not enough, also the Center on Health, Aging, and Disabilities pilot program at the university as well. Non-financial, Dr. Mattie is a member of the National Down Syndrome Society Science and Clinical Board Advisory Board. Basically, she is the guru of this, so we are so excited to have her. For me, I receive a salary as the district level dysphagia support SLP for my school district here in Houston. I'm compensated for my graduate course I teach at the University of Houston, as well as I'm a consultant for school districts across the nation to support their program development and staff training. I am receiving compensation from SpeechTherapyPD.com to host this podcast. And non-financial, I'm a member of the Texas Speech and Hearing Feeding and Swallowing Task Force. I volunteer for Feeding Matters, and I'm a member of ASHA's Special Interest Groups, Group 13, Swallowing Disorders, as well as SIG 16, School-Based Issues. Oh, I forgot to mention that Dr. Mattie will be receiving an honorarium for her presentation today. So yay. If we don't have enough, let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Laura Mattie. She is an associate professor at the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Mattie's research focuses on characterizing the emerging communicative and social phenotypes of individuals with neurogenic disabilities and the potential cascading effects of early developmental strengths and weaknesses on later outcomes. The aim of her research is to elucidate? Wow, big word. Speech path here needs some help. Some early developmental patterns and document the developmental trajectory of skills that improve communication outcomes for individuals with neurogenic disabilities. All of this will lead to the identification of treatment targets and strategies for early intervention, which will promote well-being and positive development. Oh my gosh, Laura, I'm so excited to have you with us. Let's just get started. I know we've got listeners excited for us today. Do you mind just getting us started with maybe your journey?
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And as you're reading the profile, I was like, oh, we got to tweak that a bit. We've been working a lot on being more family facing and less research facing. So I was like, oh, and hearing it makes me be like, we got to tweak that.
Okay.
Thank you. So when I started graduate school at Colorado State, I knew that I wanted to work with kids, but I didn't really know out. And so I explored some different opportunities, like becoming a child life specialist at a hospital. I really wanted that helping piece. I had done a lot of research in undergrad, but felt like I have nothing innovative for neurotypical development. That's not me. But I was a teaching assistant for the early development class. And the professor we were chatting one day about, what do I want to do? And sort of said, I don't know. And she said, well, have you ever worked with kids with Down syndrome? And I said, well, no, I've worked in a lot of places, but my mom was an SLP and she also provided respite care. And so she would bring me with her because what else are you going to do with your other kid, right? And she used to do respite for a set of twins, and one of them had Down syndrome. And I would only interact and take care of the infant with Down syndrome. And this stuck with my mom because I was 6. And what 6-year-old does this? And so my professor was like, you need to come work with me. You need to come work with these families. And my first interaction with the family and the child with Down syndrome, I was just hooked. I was like, this is it. These are the families that we can help. They want to hear from us. They want to work with us. It provides that helping piece. And so that sort of set my whole path to where I am now, which was a winding road. But after I got my PhD, I went to the University of Kansas, where I worked with Nancy Brady and Steve Warren and learned all about language and communication in a different way than I had as someone trained in development from more of a psychological human development side. And that really got me thinking about this early period of early language, early social interaction. They're so mushed together and they're all helping that early development. And we know that's setting a course for kids. I also did a postdoc at the University of South Carolina to learn more sort of about that co-occurrence of autism in these sort of other neurodevelopmental disabilities like Down syndrome. And that, again, we know we can identify those early, but it's complex when we're looking at kids with other intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then just by chance, there was the perfect job opportunity at Illinois for someone who was interested in children's disability and family well-being, which was just exactly what I wanted to do. And so getting to do what I really care about in a speech and hearing department, working with SLPs, training SLPs to go and work with these populations is just perfect fit. It just merges so well. So I'm so excited that I get to do this.
That is fantastic. I love the piece that you knew at 6.
Yeah.
It was like you were born to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you just got to find those moments.
Yeah. Not everybody has that, but that is really a neat journey. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, I know we are all super excited to jump in, and should we get some updates on current research?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to let everyone know I'm going to use person first language. I know there's a lot of discussion about identity first, person first. This is advocated for by the American Association for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and specifically the Down syndrome community. They were the kind of community really at the forefront in the 70s and 80s of using person first language. And so they haven't really made that switch back to identity first. If you really are curious about this, check out neuroclassic.com. It has some great discussions of person first versus identity first and suggestions on how to navigate that. Because we know, as the research side, that it's difficult. So I can't imagine how much harder it is out in a school day to day with everyone's opinions.
And did you say that was neuroclassic.com?
Yes, it's neuroclastic.com.
Thank you.
So I will say, when we're looking at language and communication profiles, we discuss a lot of characteristics, but there's a lot of variability from person to person in Down syndrome. And so I always like to point that out right away because it's important to remember when we're providing services to people with Down syndrome, what might have worked really well with one may not work with another. My favorite example is a lot of our kiddos, like to work for snacks. But we had one kiddo where I gave her her snack and she kind of put it in her mouth and she's sort of making a face. And I looked at her mom and she's like, she doesn't really like snacks. And I was like, oh, that's fine. You can spit it out. Do you want a high five? And she was like, yeah. Right. So we just kind of got to think about there's still a lot of variability of what's going to get them through that interaction, whatever you're trying to get them to do. Um, Broadly speaking, we do have a bigger body of research on younger kids. But when I'm saying younger, often there's not as much in that, you know, birth to 12, 18 months. There's a lot from that 24 to sort of early preschool years. And some of this is right. Kids with Down syndrome are identified early. So we can look at those skills early. But they also have a lot going on around the time of birth and medically, which is why sometimes we don't see a lot before the age of 12 months. But we do see they have these delayed language milestones, and this continues sort of across their development. But the good thing is we see a similar frequency and trajectory of those early vocalizations. So even though it's starting delayed, the pattern and what it looks like is similar to what we'd expect. So we kind of just have to think we're dealing with this delay, but we're seeing something we would expect later. We see things like first words appear later. The research sort of says 12 to 24 months. But when you look at the range in our research studies, it's anywhere from 1 to 6 years.
Okay.
So when we're starting to speak is really variable. And that's why we do have individuals with Down syndrome that benefit greatly from AAC. And so we just have this really wide range. And something we've noticed in our research is parents will report their kids are using spoken words, our young kids, but we may not hear them at all in our session. And it's just they're not using them maybe with as much frequency. It's, a new person. So that can be really variable. But we do have some strengths, and we have some strengths that start really early. So things like gestures are very strong in kids with Down syndrome. They may actually compensate for some of that spoken language difficulty with gestures. And that's why we sort of also see frequent use of sign language in young children with Down syndrome, because they're good at these gestures. They have this sort of strength relatively in their receptive language ability. So they're understanding a lot more. And so gestures can really help them to communicate. So we see that sort of they have this rate of gestures that's can actually be higher, but it's definitely similar to those with neurotypical communication abilities. They're really using those in a way that our neurotypical kids, once we have language, spoken language, kind of pull back on, right? Childhood is a lot less studied, school-age kids.
Okay.
And I think there's a couple reasons. I think, first of all, school is a lot for family, right?
Yes.
And so getting into a research study and doing all those things are difficult. But also, I think a lot of the time, the skills we expect them to have at a certain school age, they may not have yet. And so I think that makes it hard to study. And it also, a lot of our school age tasks, if you think about some of your common standardized measures, really do require often a lot of spoken language.
Of course.
And if that's a struggle, that makes them hard. And they also often have really complex instructions that are said to them, right? And that makes those tests really hard. So what we see from what's out there is that they do acquire language at that slower pace. And there's a lot of variability in that acquisition. So unlike our neurotypical milestones where we expect children to start doing grammar things here and we start to see more complex sentences, it really varies from kid to kid. And that also, I think, makes it hard for researchers and clinicians when we're kind of trying to figure out what are we going to do? What is our target? What are we trying to help a child with? They often will continue to produce those shorter, less complex utterances. And in some of those tests that we give, right, where you want a long sentence, we're just not going to get that. And they're not going to score well, right, because they just aren't hitting all of those parts we expect. We continue to have this strength in receptive language, with difficulties in expressive language. And expressive language is also rolled in with difficulties of intelligibility. So there's a sort of physical reason for intelligibility issues in Down syndrome. They tend to have really small mouths and oral cavities, but a large tongue. And so when those two things combine, it makes it hard to be understood. And so they sort of also know they're maybe not intelligible all the time, and they get frustrated when people don't understand them. And that also is going to impact how much they're using their spoken language, right? Because sort of they have that social awareness of others and know when they're not being understood, and that's frustrating.
Absolutely. I
So
think
yeah,
anybody, you're right.
exactly. Yeah. And we're not as used to that level of intelligibility issues with such, you know, school age kids. We sort of expect we've caught some of that artic early, but we can't change their mouth. Their mouth is the way it is. And that makes it hard.
Exactly. Yeah.
We see also that stronger receptive skill over expressive is across language areas. So we see it in grammar and in syntax. There seems to be, there's been some really interesting research on like grammar and verbs, which is interesting that that's what got picked out. But we know those things are really important. So they tend to produce fewer grammatical verbs and fewer lexical verbs. And they're just not using those things as much as their neurotypical peers. They're not quite sure why, but it's part of them having just shorter utterances. So they're not putting as much description and things into that sentence. Are they sort of not used to kind of telling the story with all of those pieces? It's kind of unclear. But they continue to learn syntax actually into adolescence, which is really different from our other kids with language disorders. I'm sure everyone is curious because it's school age about phonological awareness. I know that's always so big.
Absolutely.
And to say that it is a complex profile is probably an understatement. We could probably pull the phonological awareness experts and you could do a whole other episode on phonological awareness and Down syndrome. But it seems like the delays are beyond what we would expect, even their overall developmental profile. I'm going to hit some key points so we don't get way into this really complex body of literature. But we see that children with Down syndrome do have the most difficulty with rhyme. So rhyme is really hard for them. And in a recent factor analysis, they looked at different skills and they found that children with Down syndrome, all of their phonological awareness skills, so they looked at initial syllable, final syllable, rhyme, and initial phoneme, all hung together in one factor. But when they did the same set of tasks with neurotypical kids, they got 2. And so this is really interesting. And what it means is that for some reason in Down syndrome, all the skills are hanging together. And we're not sure why, but in neurotypical kids, when they're in these 2 different groupings, that means how we're learning them and the skills supporting them are coming in these 2 different areas. And we don't know why, but that might make it harder, right? If certain other skills like executive function, overall cognitive ability aren't kind of supporting PA in these different ways, we're seeing that they're really doing something different in Down syndrome. The problem, as we all know, is phonological awareness is so complex that how do we pull it apart and figure out why are they hanging together, right? Sort of the common reading suggestions in Down syndrome, you'll hear sometimes people say, oh, do whole word versus sight word. My experience with families is work with your child, work with your teacher or reading specialist, and figure out what works for their brain. Because we don't really know what piece of it is the best for them. And we don't want them just memorizing words and not understanding what they mean. So that's my little side note on reading.
No, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Different brains are different.
brains are different and reading is hard. So, yeah. And I think the last area for a lot of our school age kids that come up is pragmatic.
Yes.
We know school is where we really start to learn about these social interactions. And this is another one that's really complex in Down syndrome. And that's partially because they have that social drive and that social motivation, but they aren't great always at initiating conversation. They're a little more passive. They're doing those shorter utterances. And so that makes those pragmatic pieces difficult. But we see they do tend to provide more inferential relationships and plot points when they're retelling a story. And they do less preservative language. And they tend to have less instances of tangential topics than some other kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities. But interestingly, we see that they're using fewer emotion verbs and less mental state language, which is really interesting when they're able to tell a story, but they're not necessarily putting in the people side that you would kind of expect them to be interested in.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. I love
So,
that.
yeah.
So I'm taking it. We work on the strengths. We go with the strengths, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the profile and understanding that this is the difference. They to expect the delay, but on top
Yes.
of expecting the delay, there's not a typical norm because each child with Downs is an individual. And
Yes, exactly.
and I think that's what I heard earlier is you're saying we can't just group them as children with Down syndrome. We have to really see them individually. But understanding some of the what you were just explaining of all their communication and language profile, understanding that where they struggle with PA and just understanding how there are some
Yeah.
similarities and but knowing what their strengths are.
Yeah. And it seems like from the few intervention studies out there, looking at their strengths and how to leverage them to support difficulty seems to be sort of a pattern that we see, right? So a lot of the interventions out there you'll see might have some kind of AAC component because again, we can lean on those receptive language skills and have the AAC help us with the spoken language part, right? And so thinking about sort of what is their motivator, right? Like if we pick the wrong motivator, we may not get anything. And then you switch it up and maybe you were using trucks and cars and you got nothing. And now you switch to animals and suddenly, right, we're getting all these words and sounds. And so we're just finding that kind of special piece, I think, and which is what SLPs are doing for all their clients. But it might just look a little different with this population because we think, oh, they have Down syndrome. This is what I'm going to do. And then they're going to throw you for a loop.
Right. Okay. So maybe one of the limitations us as clinicians are when we make the assumption that all children with Down syndrome, like you said, like snacks. And you had a student disprove that.
Yes.
So just like you would. So what I'm hearing is as clinicians, we need to, yes, they are a child with Down syndrome. However, they are a child first.
Yes.
And we need to see them as the child first and really get to know them before we
exactly
the Down syndrome. Oh, they all like this. No.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think, and I don't know if this comes from the research side or where, but I think sometimes clinicians have a feeling that like they should need to know something totally different to work with clients with Down syndrome. And I think the truth is like, I want clinicians to learn to trust what you already know about language and communication. And then think about where is this child at, right? So they may be 10, but are they pretty much developmentally maybe doing things more like a 6 or 7-year-old? What would I do for a 6 or 7-year-old, right? And sort of have that shift of, I know about language development and communication. How can I then apply that to where this student is at? Because I think that it's a disservice for us to discount the experience of the clinician just broadly with these school age kids. You just got to sort of switch the mindset of, okay, they're in fifth grade, but they may not be doing everything a fifth grader does. Right.
Right.
And I think we've seen a little bit of that evidence starting to come through where if we go back to mental state language, for example, that's a skill often that's worked on in preschoolers, right? But what we're seeing is that actually in 6 to 10-year-olds with Down syndrome, the 6 and 7-year-olds aren't really doing mental state language stuff yet. So again, it's delayed. And so things like that you would do to target mental state language in preschoolers, like shared book reading, might actually be more appropriate for your first and second graders with Down syndrome. So just kind of thinking about that little shift and trusting what you know, and then thinking about what you also know about Down syndrome.
I like that because I think a lot of times at school-based clinicians, we're like, "Ah, we got to do something completely different. We got to learn something new." But you're giving us the power to say, no, we know language communication.
Yeah.
We know the development of that. Plot them where they are and use what you know. Use what's in your
Exactly.
toolbox. You don't have to change it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think, we're never that, when you look at the intervention research, first of all, for school age, there's not a lot of interventions out there, probably for all the reasons we've discussed.
Yeah.
Right. And when you look at the little kid research, a lot of that only has a handful of randomized control trials because it's a hard group to do that level of evidence-based intervention research with. There's not as many kids. They're harder to find. They're more stressed as families. And so I think we've been in this model of like, find the evidence-based intervention. But sometimes it's find the evidence-based intervention for whatever area we're targeting. And then how do we need to adjust it for this client with Down syndrome, for example? And I think the other thing that is important for me is that as a researcher in this area, I want to help the clinicians, right? To help the families. So I think that idea that like, can't reach out, right? If you're a clinician working on a specific area in Down syndrome and there's a researcher who's done something, you see a paper, reach out and ask them. Because a lot of us, before we were associate professors or whatever, we were grad students who were directly running all these studies with these kids. And so we have so much experience of things that worked and things that didn't work that we are happy to share, right? Or troubleshoot, right? Like we have a kid who, has Down syndrome and autism. What do we do, right? Those kinds of things. I think the current researchers in this area really want to help have that impact, right? We don't want clinicians feeling like we're not accessible. We want to be accessible.
That's wonderful. I love that. I think we need to be a community.
Yeah.
I always say I don't want to be the only one doing this wonderful work. I want all, and only my students are going to benefit, right? No.
Yeah.
Don't you want all students to benefit? Let's all share.
Yeah. And I think it's hard sometimes, if you're in a school and you're working every day and you're trying to get all your stuff done and see all your kids, like it might be hard to find additional information on something. But if you kind of skim some stuff and you've seen a name, just reach out and ask them like, hey, have you heard of anyone doing it with this? We might know already. And then you don't have to spend that extra time, right? Searching out journals or doing whatever that can get really frustrating when you're under such a time crunch.
Right. I think a big limitation for school-based clinicians is time. We are spread so thin, and school-based clinicians, we don't really get to specialize generally because the caseload is we don't get to pick and choose. And so, yeah, any help that is out there and we can get quickly is needed. Thank you.
I think you make a great point. I think for any grad students listening, we tend to think like, oh, I'm going to specialize in this one group, but I want to work in a school. At school, they're just its own randomized control trial of who you're going to get.
Absolutely.
So you might, not get a client with Down syndrome until you've been for 5 years and you haven't heard anything about it. And that's okay.
And that is the unique and fun. It's both a challenge and a benefit of being a school-based clinician is that we become that jack of all trades. We do get to touch on everything, but we might go a year or two that we don't have a student with this specific profile.
Yeah.
But I think what you're telling us is rely on what we do know. We don't have to, again, I just want to emphasize you're saying you're not telling us that we have to change our entire approach,
No,
but we have to know the background, the profile of the students
exactly.
and what a profile would look like with a student with Downs.
Yep.
But as you said, the delay
Mhm.
of where they are and
Yeah.
use what's in that your training and what you use in that age.
Exactly.
Well, no, I shouldn't say age, that developmental stage.
Developmental level.
Because their age, you don't want to baby it down. You want to,
Exactly.
right? I think it's
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
use the concepts you would for that younger age, but you have to treat them at the age they are because that's
Exactly.
respect.
Yeah. So I think about, again, shared book reading. Shared booking reading with a preschooler right now. You might pick, Bluey or Paw Patrol.
Right.
Bluey tends to go all ages at this point. But, if they're 10, we might be looking at, more Minecraft or something like that for that kind of activity. And so, SLPs are great at finding out what kids like. Use that same thing and then, scale it appropriately. Especially, if you sit down and you type in, narrative interventions for school age children with Down syndrome, but you're going to find one, right?
Okay.
One study. And
Yeah.
so, my thing is always like, be cautious when you're doing your Googling because the evidence is so limited,
Okay.
but you already have expertise and you know about best practices. And so we can use that information to apply it to Down syndrome because it just hasn't happened yet, where there's only so many people researching Down syndrome. And so it just takes a lot longer, I think, for us to get some of the evidence base into a place where it's actually helpful for clinicians.
Absolutely. So I shout out to graduate students if you're looking for a research topic. I think
Definitely.
there's a lot of space in the Down syndrome arena
Yes,
and
definitely.
a lot of work needs to be done.
Yeah, especially I think in these school age kids because I am also interested in early language development, but it's because I want to think about how does that affect their later development. But I think we're operating under this idea that Down syndrome is just delayed. And so just do it that way. And they hit school and just do whatever you do. But they're more complex than that. And so I think that's kind of why it kind of got paused for several decades, where there just wasn't as much happening on school age kids and it's coming back, which is really helpful because we know what's happening when they're in school age is going to help them with their transition to adulthood.
Exactly.
And so we need to have all those developmental pieces, right, working together to support them.
And for all of us in the schools, we realize that our goal is to get them ready for transition.
Exactly.
That's why they're in school. Yeah,
Exactly.
keeping that in mind of the end goal always.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to get into maybe how to do some interventions?
Yeah.
Going next? Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, most of the stuff out there is on younger kids.
Okay.
So the research that's available on school age kids or even kids under 8 in terms of intervention is really limited. And adolescence is almost not existent, which is really interesting. If anyone out there is looking for something to do, it's really, really interesting. As the interventions we have, sort of the most common for our young kids are forms of milo teaching. So, using that, very responsive, thinking about targeting those certain areas related to the word I'm looking for. It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
One of those days.
Around
About
it will,
yeah,
the nugget
it
will
come
fall
to
out.
me. So sort of integrating that natural talking environment. And
Mm.
so really focuses on communication in their everyday environment. And often there's certain targets. If you've read about any of these, there's different versions. So, enhanced Milo teaching is going to have a lot about like connecting and support. A lot of these are also have a caregiver implementation piece or support piece. There's one for, pre-spoken language. So those pre-linguistic communicators where it's working on the complexity of intentional nonverbal communication, and then adding sort of that responsivity education for parents. And so the idea being that all parents often are responsive, right? But how we're responsive matters. So
Okay.
how are we expanding or supporting or recasting? How are we modeling turn taking and those sort of things to help our child communicate? And that's sort of where we have a bulk of the early literature and a bulk of the available randomized controlled trials that have kids with Down syndrome in them. And those are all sort of a bit messy, but pretty much we sort of see that there is this sort of unique piece that we've noticed in these RCTs for Down syndrome and Milo teaching is that there seems to be sort of an interaction between having Down syndrome and the intervention, which
Okay.
it seems kind of interesting to say it that way. But a lot of those studies had kids with Down syndrome alongside kids with other intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they actually saw different patterns for kids with Down syndrome versus the other developmental disabilities. And so what they found when they sort of looked into this a little more was that the sort of increased dosage of the intervention was important for improving outcomes for children with Down syndrome.
Okay.
And so there seems to be a unique thing about how much we're providing them the intervention and how often and sort of what the intervention entails that's impacting if it's having a positive impact on their communication. We can't say necessarily like, oh, it needs to be a certain number of hours every
Right.
week. We just know that it seems to be more. So we kind of have to think about, what are we trying to intervene with? What kind of dosage would we expect? And then do we need to ramp that up a little bit to support their learning but they do, they're able to learn those early communication skills. And some things may need to be more direct. And I always think this relates to our school age kids. So it seems like teaching specific words directly is really effective. And so, you know, maybe not giving them that compound question or right, like it's a blue cat. Let's just say it's a cat. Right.
Okay.
And point to that reference and get something really clear so there's not as much other stuff. I think we like to kind of have a more conversational, right? Like, oh, what is it? And they're like, I don't know. What is it? Like, what are we talking about? And they may have a little more difficulty generalizing some of those word learning skills to things that are not the target of the intervention. So I think something to think about really is how do we think about supporting generalization of the
Okay.
skill we're teaching? They may learn it really well in this one context, but it may not always then go out the way we would expect to other things. I mentioned AAC. It's really common. It's usually an addition to an intervention. And my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, is that it can never hurt to have some form of AAC available to you, especially when working with kids with limited spoken language. So whether you want to have a couple picture pieces for what we're doing or something, you just never know when the kid will suddenly use that AAC piece to communicate with you. And there's such a difference between their receptive ability that they may be able to think, oh, you're asking me this, and it's this picture, right? And
Mhm.
hand it to you over saying cat. And so you just never know how they'll use it. And so it's always just nice to have that additional support to make them feel like they're making progress and make you feel like you found a way to communicate with.
I think all of us would agree that adding that AAC piece, especially when the research studies that you've shared with us support the fact that children with Down syndrome have present with higher receptive language. Why would we want them to fail? We're
Yeah.
wanting to do a strength-based strategy, and if their strength is receptive, give them that
Exactly.
support for the expressive so that they're truly showing us what they know,
Exactly. Exactly.
right?
And
Yeah.
I think my other thing was like, don't be afraid when someone says like, oh, AAC is not for Down syndrome. That's like old ideas. I don't know why they still exist, but they do. Use it. Use it however you would use it because all it can do is add support. And that's what is going to make everyone feel better in that session.
Right. And I think if you're giving us this research that we can go and support the reason why we're doing it, especially if we have a parent that we have parents that say, no, I want my child to talk. I want my child to talk. But we say, actually, we want your child to communicate.
Communicate.
Right. And in any form, in any
Yes.
modality. And, you know, and I think sometimes we just need to have the research backing.
Yeah.
We feel strong to say, actually, the research states yada da da da. And we're not saying that we are going to tape your child's mouth shut and not allow them to speak.
Yeah.
Going to be able to give them more than one way to communicate, which
Exactly.
which would
And tackle those myths,
tackle the myths. And I like that.
They're out there still, despite all of our hard work, right? Everyone's hard work saying, this is not what's actually happening. They still are out there. And so again, you have the good training, best practices, use it. And I always try to frame a lot of the things, especially around AAC in terms of advocacy, right?
Yes.
Right. They're not using their spoken voice much right now, but we want them to be able to tell us what they want or what they need or what's going on until they find their voice. And I think that that's a nice way to think about like, oh, if they have no way of telling someone who's not their parent what they want, then that's a really hard place for that kid to spend their whole day.
Right.
Right.
And
And I think parents don't always think about, oh, I'm not there. And I know what all the sounds mean.
right.
And so,
They speak Susie.
yes,
They speak
100%.
Susie's language. And
100%.
right. And we're not all understanding Susie's language. Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing. I'll have parents say, like, how do you know what she just said? Well, I've spent a long time listening to kids with Down syndrome talk, right? And babble. And so I'm very good at picking up, right? Because I've spent so much time with them. But
Mhm.
again, if you haven't had a client with Down syndrome in a really long time or ever, you're not going to be able just to sit down and maybe interpret everything they're saying.
Right. So what would you tell that clinician that has not either has not had a client in a while or is brand new?
Yeah.
Where should we start?
So I've said this over. You're going to be like, gosh, you're a broken record.
No.
But trust your clinical
Okay.
experience. Trust what you know about language and communication development. Trust what you know about evidence-based practices for what you're working on. Learn about the kiddo
Okay.
as much as you can. And I know sometimes you get those files and they have nothing for you to work with. And that's really difficult. And so just sort of prepare yourself for, okay, maybe I'm going to ask the parents some more questions, or I'm going to try to do a couple more assessments to try to figure out where the kid is at. I'm going to talk and interact with the kid, right? See what they do. Sometimes they might do something totally different than what you would expect because of the environment you're in. They may like that they're one-on-one with you, just a hint.
Oh, okay.
Like they like to socially interact. So just that can be to your advantage. It also can be to your disadvantage. I will tell you that. They're pretty socially intelligent. So if something's hard, they often know that. And they will do what we call a party trick to distract you. And so my favorite party trick that happened a couple of years ago, I was doing a Peabody picture vocabulary test with a kid with Down syndrome. It was getting hard, and I knew it was getting hard. And as we all know, it takes a long time to ceiling out on that PPVT. And at one point, she kind of leans back and she looks me up and down, and she goes, "I like your shirt."
Oh,
Right? Trying to start this social discussion instead of doing the task. Unfair for her. Again, I've been doing this a long time. I say, "Oh, thank you. I like your shirt. Now, can you point to that?" Right? And she's like, "Right, like it didn't work." But they will try to do that. And so they know when things are getting hard for them. And I think that's a good thing to know of how do we identify ways to motivate them through what's hard. Because I think it's easy to be like, "Oh, now they're just running around and they're going crazy." And it's like, well, maybe it's just because they know it's too hard for
right.
themselves. And so just use those skills to redirect, or do you need a break? Those kinds of things. I would say also, think about if you have any information sort of on developmentally where they're at, use that as a guidepost. It's not always available. And even if it's not sort of a cognitive based test, if it's more like functionally, if they've done some adaptive functioning measures in the past, then you kind of know where they're at. And then you don't feel like, "Oh, I'm starting too young. Am I starting too old?" Just sort of use as much information as you can get. And a lot of times parents know a lot about where their kid is. And so you can get a lot of information from the parent about that.
And I think getting parents in, and part of it, I mean, get them in on the team. I think that's a common, that's a should be a foundation. Is
I totally agree.
right?
I do. I think especially for our kids with language disorders, whether it's a Down syndrome or something else, they're doing a lot of language outside of school,
Sure.
right? And so, I think some parents maybe have that feeling of like school is where this happens, but it is happening at home. And maybe it's happening totally different at home, right? And so maybe it's going great for you at school, right? They're communicating, they're requesting, they're doing all the things you want. And then you come to find out like at home, they're not. And so how do we help those generalization pieces again? So having parents and caregivers be our partners, I think is just a better experience for everybody, so that you're on a team together for this child.
Yeah, I love the team, but I'm going to go back to when you said dosage and frequency.
Yeah.
And you said that they require higher dose and more frequency. That's a lot to put on the shoulders of a speech pathologist that
Yeah.
has a huge caseload.
Exactly.
So I think I'm hearing that when you're partnering
Mhm.
with not only the teacher, but with the paraprofessionals and the family,
Yes.
that's where you're increasing the frequency.
Exactly.
And the dosage is when we're all on that team. So we're not saying,
Yeah.
okay, speech pads, you're going to have to take this child one-on-one,
Right. Exactly. It's
Just know
not
that
feasible.
that is not feasible. So we want to make sure
But
that
use,
yeah.
use that idea of like communication's happening all the time. Let's use everybody.
Mhm.
Right. And all that can do is help. So if we tell the teacher, we tell the para, we tell the parents, like, "Hey, this is what we're working on. Here's some of the things I do that might work for you." Because a lot of times people don't really know what the SLP is doing, which is always, I'm always surprised, but
You're right.
it's like they just don't realize what you're doing, and that it's actually something that they could do additionally, right, to help the child. Because we SLPs are special and they do have special knowledge, but they also want to share that, right? It's not,
Absolutely.
they're not keeping it for themselves. And so, yeah, use the team to get in that frequency and that dosage, even if it's something small, like we're trying to work on, you know, telling us full story. Well, probably in class, they're doing something about that.
Right. That's an
Here's
effort.
how I'm helping them in, here I'm giving them pictures to help them talk through it. We can use that in class, those kinds of things.
Right. Because language does not just happen in the speech room.
No.
And
Well,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Talk about the getting language and
It's
also is
everywhere.
motivating would be they're so let's use their strengths. I mean, let's go back
Yes.
to that and touch on their social awareness
Yes.
and how can we use that strength
Yeah.
knowing that they're wanting to be social. Let's give them scenarios for that.
Scenarios. Yeah. I think kids with Down syndrome especially are great candidates for anything peer-based that you're thinking about.
Okay.
And I have found, and this might just be my experiences, but that often our kids with Down syndrome already have relationships with the other kids in their classroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's different than some of our other disabilities. They seem to very much integrate well with the classroom. And neurotypical kids often like to help, right? And they also they also are curious, like, why do you get to hang out with this person, right? And what do you get to do with this person that comes into the classroom and does things with you? And so it's a great opportunity to do some peer-based communication options. They like to help. I've seen great examples, especially with things like AAC. Kids are, first of all, of course, they're intrigued by the AAC, but they also grasp very quickly that it's not a toy. They're very good at grasping this as how they communicate. And I've seen some great studies where they have had the peer actually modeling communication on the AAC with the child. That's the target. And that it helps, right? Your peer is doing it. It's not an adult, it's a peer. And, they're a great tool for our kids, especially our kids with Down syndrome that want to be socially interacting. They like other kids. Usually other kids are interacting with them already. And so we can use those, whether it's through, in kindergarten and first grade, some push in to some more like direct peer mediated approaches. I think that's a great option for these kids.
And I think for the school-based clinician, we want I love hearing that to give me that let's go in, let's push in. And I liked what you said about having your peers utilizing AAC because don't we want to do what our friends are doing. And if our
Yeah.
friends are doing it,
Yeah.
we want to do it.
Yeah. And there's also that sort of normalizing of
Yeah.
inclusive practices. And
Mhm.
I think we often forget how much, take AAC, for example, that we all use every day, right? Like we're using tech, we're using voice to speech, we're using all of this stuff day to day. And it makes things more acceptable and more inclusive. And it's how we interact. And so let's just continue to do that with these more specialized, quote unquote, techniques.
Perfect. Okay, Laura, where do we want to go next? We have
Let's see. I think the one thing I don't think I've fully mentioned is the few and kind of tap the few school age specific intervention. So there has been some interventions for phonological awareness and reading and literacy, a couple for grammar and intelligibility, and one for narratives. My biggest caveats when you're looking at those, they tend to be pretty small samples. So we know that's not always helpful. And there's often not a control group. And
okay.
so it's hard to say if they're gaining skills, but it's hard to say compared to what, right? We want them to gain skills, and that's what matters. There wasn't a meta-analysis of sort of all these sort of school-aged studies a couple of years ago. And it really just, again, hit this piece of, it does seem like they help. So yay, right? It's not that the interventions are hurting kids. They're helping kids with Down syndrome learn these skills. But the biggest thing that came up was we don't know the duration and the frequency. Right.
Okay.
And so we've talked about that a lot. And so we're seeing that same sort of piece come up where people are trying these interventions and it keeps coming out that we need to look at how long we're doing it and the frequency. And again, that just makes me think of, and then we have to think about how do we make that feasible
Yeah.
for the clinicians? Because what we can do in a, research setting is so different than what can be done in a real world setting. So, I would say those studies, when you're looking for things, might have great tips on how to tackle a certain area. And especially since they've been done in Down syndrome, you can see sort of what they tried and what they did, but don't feel defeated if what you look for, there's nothing. And that's kind of my, I wish as researchers we had all the answers for everybody, but we just don't yet. And so, that's where it comes back to using what you know about that skill that you're targeting.
Okay. So you are encouraging us, yes, go look for the research as we would for any student
Anything.
coming
Exactly.
in, but then realizing we can still let's use what we have in our toolbox already because that is your best practice. That's your evidence right there. Is what
Yes.
when you're looking at this skill, what is out there?
Yeah.
Then
Exactly.
you've got to get the knowledge of the profile of your students.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Because again, we're seeing a shift just broadly towards this discussion of precision medicine, which becomes into like precision intervention, which is taking the skills for just that kid, right? And that's really what we've been doing as SLPs, right? Is taking the information and applying it to that specific kid's needs. And so while these big interventions are great and important for the evidence base,
Okay.
they're not always going to help you with that one specific kid.
Right. Because there's still the kid as the individual. And I think that's kind of where we're coming back again,
Yes.
is just that you've got to take each student like you do as an individual.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think you've really laid down a lot of research for us, but
Yeah.
also telling us that yes, the research is out there, but there's not a ton of it. So hey,
Yeah.
you're charging some of us that are listening, wondering what they should do their research on Down syndrome, apparently,
Yeah.
right? You've helped us understand that a student with Down syndrome we look at it as they do have language development. It is delayed, but you're saying there's so much variability with that. You can't just say it's a delay. You have to really see where you've got to get in there
You do. Yeah.
and see really where are they at. And once you know kind of where they're plotted on, where they developmentally, that's where you're going to target. You're going to target where
Exactly.
they are developmentally to support that, but you've got to augment that with the fact of where they are chronologically.
Yes. Exactly. This is a lot of work.
It is. That
It
was
is.
exhausting just for me to even
Yes.
say.
Yeah. And I think that's why it feels overwhelming as the
Absolutely.
clinician, because you're
Yes.
like, oh gosh, where do I start? Right.
Mhm.
And so, take your deep breath and think about what you know about Down syndrome, about why are they here to see you? What are your goals? What are everyone's goals? And then go from there.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ties us
And
up. Nice.
I will say, I think that partnering with families with Down syndrome, my experience is they want a partner. So don't be afraid of that. And don't be
Right.
afraid of asking them.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I liked, the point is everybody should be involved. This isn't just something that is on the shoulders of the SLP.
Yeah.
This is really a team effort.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think what I'm hearing, and tell me if I'm wrong, but co-implementing goals for a student with this profile is a benefit because of when you were saying they need that dosage and frequency
Yes.
increase. And that just can't be done by the speech path alone. And so
No.
you're empowering us to be like, these goals really should be co-implemented
Yes.
implemented goals
Yeah.
for a student with this type of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it also aligns with that piece of we don't always see them generalizing skills the way we'd expect. But if we're getting it everywhere, then we don't have to. I think we're often stressing about generalization. But if we're doing it
Absolutely.
everywhere, then we don't have to stress as much about generalization.
Right. So if we're going to have the takeaway is let's get everybody on board, work as a team, everybody working on the goal in order for generalization, because we're doing it in all settings.
Yes.
That's our takeaway.
Yes.
And the second one is we need more research. We need more researchers.
Yes.
She's out there. Laura will be like, get in touch with me. I will give you some topics. Please.
Yeah.
Reach out to Laura.
Yeah. And I think my last one is trust what you know and ask researchers. Reach out. We're here.
I love it. She's opened the door, people.
I have.
Everybody's listening.
I'm great with that.
I love it. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. I have loved this conversation. You've inspired me. I think you are an amazing guest. You've got such a wealth and breadth of knowledge on this. This is wonderful just to hear what you've done and what you're doing. And what I really like is you basically told us we're okay, we're doing good. And what we need to do is just get everybody on board and let's all do it together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
All
thank
right.
you for having me. I've so enjoyed getting to share this with you and with the listeners. I love the opportunity to get people excited about supporting kids with Down syndrome.
I love it. Thank you so much. We really do look forward to hopefully seeing you again because I think you've got a lot to share with us.
Me too. Anytime.
I love it. All right, everyone. We're going to say bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We appreciate your positive reviews and support and would love for you to write a quick review and subscribe. If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. For our School of Speech listeners, we have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. The code is SCHOOL20. That is SCHOOL20. Hope to see you on our next episode. Also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comment section or send us a message on social media.